Arizona Territory, 1878. The stagecoach wheels were still warm when the smoke cleared, but every soul but one was gone. Geneva Sutton stood in the middle of the red dust road, her gloved hands trembling as she stared down at the torn hem of her traveling skirt and the broken door of the stage. Her bonnet hung by one ribbon from her shoulder, and blood, someone else's, not hers, was drying in a smear across her sleeve. The driver was dead. So was the man who had sat beside her, a merchant from El Paso. The other passengers had vanished into the hills with the bandits, dragged screaming or running for their lives. She had survived only because she had been thrown. When the outlaw's shotgun went off, the mules spooked, and she had been tossed from the coach like a rag. She had landed hard, rolled, and when she opened her eyes again, the world had gone quiet. Now, alone in the middle of nowhere, her lips cracked from the sun and heart hammering in her chest, Geneva slowly turned in a circle. Sand, rocks, scorched brush. A buzzard circled overhead. She tried not to cry. Her father had sent her west from Charleston with a letter of introduction and a promise: go to Tuxen, find the schoolhouse, teach, and marry well. That was the plan. That was always the plan. But the stage lay in splinters, and the plan with it. The wind shifted. A horse approached. Geneva spun, heart surging, then stumbled backward into the broken coach door. She grabbed one of the brass railings, ready to swing it like a club if she had to. The rider came into view, tall in the saddle, hat pulled low against the sun. But when he got closer, she saw him more clearly. A young man, maybe mid-20s, broad across the shoulders. A rifle slung across his back, but his hands were raised in peace. His boots were dusty, coat-worn, but his eyes were steady, brown, and heartbreakingly kind. "Miss," he called. "Are you hurt?" Geneva blinked. Her mouth opened, but the words caught. She shook her head instead. He dismounted in one smooth motion and walked to her, slow, careful. "My name's Jack Nolan. I was riding to Benson when I saw the smoke. I thought maybe the stage had broken a wheel." "I did not expect this." Geneva's throat worked. "They took," she choked, then tried again. "Bandits, they took the others. I do not know where they went." Jack's eyes flicked down the road, then back to her. "You are bleeding." She looked down, dazed, and saw a shallow cut on her palm. She had not even noticed. "I have a canteen," he said, already pulling it from his saddle, "and a blanket. We will get you off this road first." She nodded numbly. He helped her drink, then eased her up onto his horse. She sat sideways, trembling, while he gathered what little he could from the wreck: her satchel, a bent parasol, a bloodied lace glove. Then he climbed up behind her, his arms careful not to touch her more than needed. They rode in silence for miles. The sun dipped lower, painting the hills gold. Geneva leaned back slightly, too exhausted to keep straight, and felt Jack's chest against her shoulder. He did not shift away. By the time they reached a small cabin nestled near a dry riverbed, dusk had fallen. He helped her down without a word, led her inside, and lit a lamp. The cabin was simple: one bed, a small table, a stove, but it was clean, safe. Jack offered her a tin cup of coffee and sat across from her while she drank. "Are you sure they are gone?" she asked. He nodded once. "I tracked them west. Far enough that they will not circle back tonight." "You tracked them?" "I was a scout for the cavalry. Before I left that behind." Geneva studied him. His hands were scarred, but his voice was soft. He looked away when she stared too long. "I do not know what I would have done if you had not come," she said, quieter now. He met her gaze. "You do not owe me anything." "I know," she whispered. "But thank you anyway." He stood then, took a step, then paused. "The bed is yours. I will take the chair. If you are cold, the blanket is thick." "I am not cold," she said, though she was shivering. He nodded. "Good night, Miss Sutton," but she did not sleep right away. She lay in the bed and listened to the night sounds: the creak of the chair as he shifted, the low howl of wind outside, the faint thump of her own heartbeat. She had not noticed it until now, but she did not feel afraid anymore. That night, Geneva dreamed of brown eyes watching over her in the dark, and the steady warmth of someone who came when she needed him most. By morning, the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and dry earth. Geneva stirred beneath the quilt, the stiffness in her limbs reminding her she wasn't in her father's Charleston parlor. She sat up slowly, the borrowed flannel shirt she'd slept in brushing her wrists, and listened. A kettle rattled faintly near the stove. Jack stood over the hearth, coaxing flame from ash. He didn't speak until he heard the floor creak behind her. "There's coffee, if you want it." She stepped into her boots and crossed the room. "I would, thank you." He poured it into a tin mug without turning. "There's some bread and lard." "Not much, but it'll hold you over." She took the cup, careful not to brush his fingers. "You live out here alone?" "I do." She waited, but he didn't offer more. They ate in silence, the wind pressing against the window panes. Outside, a quail darted beneath the brush, its plume bobbing. Geneva watched it move, let the warmth of the mug ground her. "I need to get to Tuxen," she said, once she'd finished the last bite of bread. "I'm expected." Jack didn't look up. "Wagon trail cuts west about 10 miles from here. I'll take you that far." She hesitated. "You don't have to." His gaze lifted to hers. "I know." Something about the way he said it plain, without obligation, made her chest tighten. She helped rinse the tin plates in the basin, then packed what little she had into her satchel. As Jack saddled the horse, she stepped outside. The morning sun hit the ridgeline, casting long shadows over the dry wash. She squinted toward the horizon. "They'll be looking for the others," she said as he approached with the reins. "They'll find signs," he answered, "but not much else. Bandits like that don't leave trails when they don't want to." She didn't ask how he knew that. Something in his voice told her not to. They rode out slow, dust rising behind them. Geneva sat forward this time, both legs to one side, her knuckles pale against the saddle horn. Jack didn't speak unless it was to point out a landmark, a line of petroglyphs carved into a canyon wall, the twisted skeleton of a coach wheel half buried in sand. After several miles, the trail widened and the land began to flatten. The sun climbed, hot and high. He drew the horse to a stop near a cluster of mesquites. "This is where I leave you." She dismounted, legs unsteady, and turned to face him. "How far to Tuxen?" 2 days' walk. Less if you catch a freight wagon. You'll find one by dusk if you follow the wheel ruts." She nodded, then swallowed. "You've been kind." "I didn't do it to be kind," her breath caught. "Then why?" He looked at her then, long and quiet. "Because you were alone." She didn't answer right away. The wind tugged at her skirt. "I don't know your story," she said finally. "But I'd like to." He glanced past her toward the distant hills. "Nothing worth telling. Maybe let me be the judge of that." He studied her face as if memorizing what he saw. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. "If you find yourself needing a place to rest on your way back, should you ever be heading back, I'll be here." She took the paper and tucked it into her satchel. "You think I'll be coming back? I think you've got more grit than most." He tipped his hat once, then turned the horse. She watched him ride off until he disappeared into the shimmer of heat and dust. She stood there a long time after, until the wind stilled and the mesquites stopped rustling. Then she turned her face toward the ruts in the trail and began to walk. The freight wagon rumbled into Tuxen just past dusk, its wheels chewing through the last stretch of cracked earth before the first clapboard buildings rose against the darkening sky. Geneva sat tucked beneath a tattered canvas, her skirt stiff with dust and her eyes fixed on the glow of lanterns along the main street. Her legs ached from hours pressed against rough wood, and behind her temples a dull throb bloomed with each jostle, but she was upright, breathing. Moving forward, the driver, a grizzled man with a voice like gravel, dropped her near the edge of the plaza without ceremony. She thanked him anyway, adjusted the strap of her satchel, and set off in search of the schoolhouse. The town was smaller than she'd imagined. A single church steeple stood over the roofs like a sentinel. The scent of hot iron and mesquite smoke clung to the air. She passed a saloon where laughter spilled into the street and a mercantile with its shutters drawn. The schoolhouse, when she reached it, was no more than a narrow building of adobe and timber. A bell hung crooked above the doorway. Inside, a woman with wind-bitten cheeks and a clipboard of slanted handwriting looked her over from behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Geneva Sutton." "You're the one from Charleston." "Yes, ma'am, you're late. There was a robbery, the stage, no need," the woman cut in briskly. "You're here now, we've no time for mourning when children need letters and sums." She tapped the clipboard. "You'll lodge with Miss Archer around the corner." "Room's small. She keeps hens." "Mind the rooster he bites." Geneva nodded. Miss Archer's home was a leaning two-room cottage with a sagging porch and a sour rooster that lunged at her hem before she'd even reached the door. The room offered was scarcely longer than the bed inside it, but the sheets were clean and the window faced east. She lay awake that night, listening to the soft scratch of claws on the roof tiles, and thought of mesquite trees and the note folded in her satchel. She didn't read it, not yet. The days that followed passed in a quiet rhythm. Mornings brought chalk dust and the high pitch of children's voices. Afternoons were quieter, spent copying lessons by lamplight or walking the edge of the town with her hands clasped tight behind her back. The desert stretched beyond every fence, endless and pale. She hadn't seen Jack Nolan again, nor heard word of the bandits, but she carried the memory of that ride through the hills like something stitched into her skin. One evening, as she rinsed her hands in the pump basin behind Miss Archer's coop, a voice called from the gate. "Miss Sutton," she turned, heart suddenly too loud in her chest. A boy no older than 12 stood there, hat in hand, dust on his sleeves. "Man at the stables says you'd want to know. Fella came in asking for you, said he was headed out again by sunup." Her throat tightened. "Did he leave a name?" The boy nodded. "Said you'd know him." She gave him a coin for his trouble, then dried her hands on her apron and walked fast toward the stables, pulse quickening with every step. The sun had already dropped below the rooftops, and lanterns flickered low in their brackets. She found him near the back, where the smell of hay and leather blended into the warm hush of horses settling in their stalls. He was brushing down a bay gelding, sleeves rolled to his elbows, and when he turned at her footsteps, his expression was unreadable. "I didn't know if you'd come," he said. "I wasn't sure you meant me to." "I did." She stepped closer, the silence between them thick with everything unspoken. "Why now?" she asked. Jack leaned against the stall door, arms crossed loosely. "I was hauling freight up through Rincon Pass, thought about riding on, but I heard your name mentioned near the mail wagon, and well, there's not many Suttons with a Charleston accent." She looked down at her boots. "I wasn't sure I'd see you again. I wasn't sure I should let myself hope," his voice caught, "but I did. Every day." She met his eyes then, and everything she'd held tight since that broken day on the road, the fear, the grief, the strange, quiet ache rose up and pressed behind her ribs. "I'm not the same woman who started out on that coach," she said quietly. "I know. I don't have much here, a room with a rooster, a job I'm still learning how to hold." Jack's gaze didn't waver. "I don't need much. Just a reason to stay." She hesitated, then reached into her pocket and unfolded the scrap of paper he'd given her. The edges were worn now, the creases soft from being touched too often. "You never wrote anything on it," she said. "I figured if you ever looked at it, you'd already know what it meant." She folded it again and held it out to him. When he stepped forward to take it, she didn't let go. "I want to see what this is," she said, voice low. "Not just because you pulled me from wreckage or carried me through the hills, but because when you looked at me, it was the first time I didn't feel like something broken." He nodded, his breath slower now. "You never were." She smiled, small, steady. "Come visit tomorrow. The children are learning their letters. You can write something on the board." "What should I write?" "Start with your name." She looked at his hands, calloused and gentle. "Then maybe mine." He brought one hand to her cheek, hesitant, as if afraid she might vanish, but she didn't flinch. And when he leaned in slow, certain, she closed her eyes and let the desert quiet fall all around them. The next morning, Jack waited behind the schoolhouse fence, his hat in his hands and the collar of his shirt newly pressed. He'd ridden into town before sunrise, stabled his horse near the smithy, and walked the last stretch with dust still clinging to his boots. The sound of children reciting their letters carried through the open windows, high and uneven, like birdsong blown off course. He didn't step inside. He waited, leaning against the fence post, until the recitation ended and Geneva appeared at the doorway, brushing chalk from her skirt. "You came," she said, shading her eyes with one hand. "I said I would." She nodded toward the door. "They're learning to use ink pens without blotting everything they own. You ever try to keep 20 fingers out of one inkwell? Not unless those fingers belong to colts." She smiled faintly, then stepped down into the yard. The air was warming quick, the kind of heat that crept up from the ground and settled into your lungs. "I have a break until the bell," she said. "Walk with me," he held the gate for her. They made their way past the edge of the churchyard, where the mesquite trees offered a little shade. A few townsfolk nodded as they passed, most too polite to ask questions aloud, though he could feel their eyes settle on them as they moved. "You staying on after today?" she asked. "I hadn't planned to." "But I can." Her fingers brushed the branch of a nearby tree, pulling off a brittle leaf and letting it fall. "I've been thinking," she said. "If you're riding freight through these parts again, there's something you might help me with." He looked over at her, quiet. "There's a boy who hasn't come back to school since the robbery. His sister says he's been afraid to go near the road. He's one of my brightest pupils." She paused, then added, "He trusts men who don't raise their voice." Jack nodded slowly. "I could stop by, help him check his traps, maybe." "Talk if he wants." Geneva glanced at him, something unreadable behind her expression. "You're good with children, then." "Spent a few years helping raise my brothers when he died. The oldest was 6, took to following me around like a burr." He paused. "Never thought I'd miss that sound till it was gone." She slowed, letting the breeze catch her skirt. "You don't talk about them, your family." "There's not much left to talk about. Ma passed in the fever. Pa went before her. My brother and his wife died crossing the Salt River in a flood." He looked away. "The youngest girl was taken in by kin in Kansas. I wrote once, never heard back. I'm sorry," she said, her voice low. He met her gaze. "I don't carry it around anymore. But it's still there, same as a scar." They reached the edge of the corral where 2 mules stood swishing their tails beneath a crooked cottonwood. The world felt quieter there somehow. "I never asked what made you say yes to coming west," Jack said. "Besides your father's wishes." She folded her arms across her middle. "After my mother died, the house was too still. My father filled it with guests and music and tea, but none of it touched the quiet. I thought if I left, I might hear something different, something real." He nodded. "And have you?" "I'm not sure yet, but I think I'm getting closer." The school bell rang in the distance, thin and sharp. Geneva turned toward the sound, but lingered. "There's a church supper tomorrow," she said. "They'll have stew if you can believe it. And music that drifts off-key." "I never minded off-key. You'd be welcome, Jack." He nodded once. "Then I'll be there." She started back toward the schoolhouse, pausing at the edge of the yard. "And Jack, yes, I'd like it if you stayed on." "Not just for the boy." He didn't answer with words. Just watched her walk back inside, the sun catching on the soft curve of her shoulder as the door swung shut behind her. He remained by the tree for a long while, until the wind shifted and the smell of chalk and ink drifted faintly from the windows again. The supper was held in the churchyard beneath strings of lanterns hung from the eaves and tree limbs, their yellow lights swaying gently in the breeze. Long tables had been set out, mismatched chairs brought from homes and the meeting hall. People gathered with bowls in hand, voices low and easy, the kind of conversation that came from long weeks of hard work and the rare chance to rest among neighbors. Jack arrived just before dusk settled in full, his shirt collar brushed clean and his coat freshly mended. He nodded to a few men near the horses but didn't linger. His eyes moved across the yard until he found her Geneva, standing near a table where a red checked cloth flapped like a flag. Her hair was pinned up with more care tonight, and she wore a dress the color of river clay, plain but well-fitted. She reached for a ladle of stew just as he stepped beside her. "Miss Sutton," he said, voice warm. "Mr. Nolan." She handed him a bowl, her fingers brushing his only briefly. "I saved you some before the bottom of the pot turned to paste." "I owe you." "You do," she said, eyes steady on his, "but I'll let you repay me in conversation." He followed her to a bench beneath a cottonwood where the light was thinner and the noise softer. She tucked her skirt beneath her as she sat, her posture relaxed in a way it hadn't been since they'd first met on that broken stretch of road. He took a bite of stew, then looked over at her. "Did you ever teach back east?" "No, I read to children at the parish sometimes." "But this is my first real post. You took to it fast." "I had to," she said. "They needed someone who wouldn't scare when the roof leaked or a boy threw stones at the windows. You don't scare easy." "I did," she said, voice low, "after the stage." But it passed. He nodded once, then set his bowl aside. When I was younger, I thought fear made you weak. Now I think it just shows you're still living, still got something to lose. She looked away, then back. What is it you want to build for yourself, Jack? He took his time with the answer. A place where no one has to earn their rest, where the work's honest and the company's steady, nothing grand, just something that holds. She nodded slowly. That's not so far from what I want. The music started up near the porch, an old fiddle, a guitar with one string tuned wrong, and a washboard keeping time. Couples began to pair off, some swaying, others stepping carefully as dust rose around their boots. I never learned to dance properly, she said. I never had much rhythm, he replied. She stood anyway and held out her hand. Then we'll be a matched pair. Jack took it, calloused palm to hers, and she led him into the ring of lamplight. Their steps were slow, uncertain at first, but they found a rhythm that belonged only to them, quiet, sure, and not rushed by the world around them. As the music played, Geneva leaned her head against his shoulder. Jack's hand settled gently at her back, anchoring her. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Later, they walked back through the darkened street beneath stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Miss Archer's house loomed ahead, the windows dark. Geneva stopped at the gate, fingers curled around the top rail. I'm not sending you away, she said softly. I'm not walking off, he replied. She looked up at him, and in the quiet of that breath, something shifted between them, not sudden, not dramatic, just a steady knowing that neither of them wanted to be apart again. I want a life that's real, she said. Not one built out of expectation. Not one that belongs to someone else's plan. He reached up and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. Then let's build it together. They didn't kiss, not yet, but her hand slipped into his, and they stood there beneath the stars long after the music had faded. The next morning, Jack returned with a trunk lashed behind his saddle and the gelding trailing behind. He'd found a room above the smithy for now, and work hauling timber for the church addition. He took his meals at Miss Archer's table and walked Geneva to the schoolhouse each morning. Weeks passed, then months. Summer gave way to the dry hush of autumn. Jack began helping repair the fence around the school. He taught the children how to mend harness and tie proper knots. Geneva let them stay late some afternoons, practicing their letters by lamplight while she and Jack shelled beans at the porch rail. One evening, as they sat watching the sun drop behind the hills, he turned to her and said, "You still have that scrap of paper." She reached into her apron and pulled it free. The edges were nearly worn through now. "I've been thinking," he said. "It's time we put something on it." She looked at him, eyes shining. "What did you have in mind?" He pulled a folded page from his coat, a license signed and sealed by the circuit preacher. Her name beside his, inked in careful script. "I'd like to share your name if you'll give it." "I will," she whispered. They married beneath the cottonwood in the schoolyard, the children tossing wildflowers and the townsfolk gathered close. Miss Archer wept into her handkerchief. The rooster stayed tied behind the fence. That night, as they sat together by the stove in their new home, a two-room cabin near the edge of town, walls still smelling of fresh-cut pine, Jack reached for her hand. "No more waiting," he said. "No more alone," she replied, and they kept their promise. Years passed. The school grew, and so did their family. A cradle rocked in the corner, and laughter echoed through the doorway each evening. Jack's hands stayed rough, Geneva's eyes soft, and their love quiet, steady, and built from the hardest days held fast through every season. They never needed grand declarations. Only the daily proof of care, the long silences filled with knowing, and the strength of two people who had chosen, wholly and without question, to build a life where nothing was taken for granted and everything was earned together.